So, I'm Phil Sturgeon, part of the PHP League, who's heard of the League? Anyone? Nice. We are a group of people that are running around the internet stealing other people's codes just to inflate my ego, apparently, but let's move on. This clicker doesn't work. I'm sad. It's working a minute ago. Never mind. I can do this. What the fuck? Okay, I have to like specifically click. This is my first time speaking. I apologize. My computer is shot. Hey. Seriously, it won't. Okay, as long as I click super hard, it's fine. So, let's get on with this shit show. I'm Phil Sturgeon. I was a framework interoperability advocate for a long time. That comes from me basically spending a lot of time working on CodeIgniter, Fuel PHP. Then I switched to using Laravel, and I used a lot of different packages and a lot of different bits of code that wouldn't work on different frameworks. So, it got very frustrating jumping around between different projects and not being able to use the same code. So in the end, after I quit CodeIgniter and Fuel PHP, the next time I needed to make a package, I didn't know where to put it. It couldn't live under the Pyro brand. It didn't really have anywhere to go. I didn't really want to put it under the Sturgeon namespace. That seemed like a weird place to put it, and believe it or not, I'm not that egocentric. So I started coming up with an idea of a kind of a shared component vendor for me and my friends to use. The original name was the PHP Super Best Friends Club, which we really enjoyed. We really enjoyed that, but the trouble was coming up with a PHP namespace for that, or a composer namespace was pretty tricky. We were like besties for a bit, it didn't really fly. We tried like PHP, SBFC, but no one could spell it. So in the end, we settled with League. The League of Extraordinary Packages was originally meant to just be, well, it is just a joke, like that Sean Connery movie. Anyone know the movie based on old comics and stuff? We ended up getting a lot of abuse for calling ourselves extraordinary. I was assuming that the real fun would come because we had the word packages in there. I thought everyone would think it was a dick joke, but it wasn't intended to be. But luckily, that's the only thing that people haven't freaked out about out of all the various things they could have. The idea of extraordinary isn't that we think we're better than everyone else. We don't think that at all. The idea is there's a lot of really bad PHP code floating around. We all know this. That's not a surprise to us. There's PHP classes. Pretty much 90% of that is awful. There's a bunch of stuff that just really isn't that good. So by aiming to be extraordinary, we're aiming to be better than the average because the average is kind of bad. So we're aiming to be as good as we can, not saying we're better than everyone else. I think spilling a bottle of water on my computer this morning might be the source of my problems. So here are some of the packages. You're not meant to read that. It's not wildly important. This is taken from the homepage of thephpleague.com. These are some of the packages we've got, and we've got loads of them. We've got a CSV package, which does a whole bunch of really cool stuff. You can use generators to iterate through a massive 5 gig file without reading the whole thing into memory and crashing your server. Factory Muffin is a PHP port of Factory Go, which is cool for generating test data. Fractal, which is kind of a serialization thing to make your JSON APIs kind of have a view layer, so you're not just wildly throwing your entire database row into the JSON and exposing password secrets. We've got loads of other stuff. I've got OmniPay as well, which is managed by Kayla now, which is an amazing gateway for writing the same bit of code and then just flipping a switch, and now you work with PayPal, now you work with Stripe. Very cool stuff. Yeah, that's very good. Fly System's been included in the core of Laravel 5, I believe. So that is the most popular by far. We've got like 2 million installations of Fly System or something like that. So turns out Laravel's kind of popular. So part of making the group of extraordinary packages was we had to work out the things that we found to be important. We had to work out what we wanted to strive to achieve to make our code better than other bits of code. And this kind of started as a grudge list of things that other people don't do. So the first thing is kind of meh. You have to use the League namespace, whatever. That's just because it would be really weird if every package had a different namespace. We use PSR2, whether you like it or not. We can argue about tabs versus spaces later. I don't care, but we do use PSR2. Shove it on Packagist, no need for PEAR. I'm going to go through a lot of these other things in kind of more detail, separate slides. So the idea of this talk is mostly how you can successfully release open source code and you can kind of become a slightly better developer in the course of it. And it's split in 3 sections, which is make, market, and maintain, the 3 very important parts to releasing and managing an open source project. There's a bunch of things to consider before we get going, some things you should do, some things you shouldn't. The main thing, I don't know if anyone saw my blog rant, one of my many, about Attack of the Clones, about how if you look at certain things like routing, for example, or routing in America, you have about 20,000 routing packages. I only need 1, to be fair. Maybe there's a few different approaches you can use, but there are so many. So the first thing to think about is, does it exist already? Now, just because something exists doesn't mean you can't do it in a better way, but if you're making a piece of code that's incredibly similar to another piece of code just because you don't like the names they use for their methods or something, then you're wasting your time and everybody else's time. It's splitting the work that could be done drastically. And the whole point of the league and things like it and framework agnostic packages, which I always bang on about, is that we can all come together and work on things together. Instead of there being a Laravel version and a CodeIgniter version and a whatever else version, we can all come together and work on things together. But if you're splitting off and making clones of exactly the same package over and over again, then we're still wasting time. We're not making a Laravel and a CodeIgniter version, we're making a foo and a bar version, and it's just completely pointless. So people from that rant thought I was talking about, like, I don't like innovation, and if we should all just use the same one thing. If you have a unique way of doing something, you can totally do that. So a good example to stick with the routing example is Nikita Popov, who's a core PHP developer, made a fast route, which is a really awesome... Never had this many problems. Well, whatever, I'll just talk. Made a really interesting routing package, which is drastically faster than everything else. It uses a fundamentally new approach. Most of them have a big array, or they have a series of methods that you call to register a route. And then it kind of makes this big array, and it loops through them all and does like a regex on each separate one, which is incredibly slow. And the way that Nikita Popov did it is using this really impressive like grouped regex that just does them all in one go, and it's blindingly fast. So that would be an example of doing the same thing that's been done before, but in a better way, and being unique. Sadly, the other 19,998 are exactly the same bloody thing. For the love of God. So, a main thing you need to consider is, do you have the time for it? A lot of people, they write a little bit of code and they go, oh, this is awesome, I can make a package out of that. I'm going to bung it up on Reddit and everyone's going to love it and it's going to be amazing. And they shove it on GitHub and then they forget about it and they don't do anything with it. And this happens all the time, and it's really annoying. The time commitments that you find when you release a lot of these bits of code are things like documentation can take between like 10 and 20 hours just to make some docs that people then complain about. To make docs that people don't complain about takes more like a week of solid effort. It's really hard. So just the documentation alone can be a week's project. And don't just shove it up on Reddit. Like, I don't look at Reddit anymore because my blood pressure cannot handle it, but there's been so many times that someone said, what do you think of this new bit of code? And you look at the commits and it's initial commit 1 hour ago, or like 20 minutes ago. And it's just a piece of crap that they haven't really thought about. And you need to spend a bit more time than that. It's good to get feedback early, don't get me wrong, but don't broadcast it to the entire world after about 20 minutes. So that's a lot of me saying that it's terrible and it's hard and whatever else, but there are amazing things that come from working in the open source world. I've been doing open source since I was about 11, I think, and I've met a lot of really cool, interesting people along the way. Some of the people on the league, the people that are part of it, are my friends that I've met through random open source work. I first spotted their face on a pull request or on Subversion commits before that was a thing. And these people, I help them get jobs. They help me get jobs. We refer each other. We meet at conferences. It's amazing. And these friends are better friends than I grew up with. I just knew through the internet, all through open source work. So it's a lot of fun. And you learn a lot too. The stuff that, yay, the animation worked. Something's going right. So you learn all these things. You start off like, oh, I'm just going to write a bit of PHP code. Then, oh, okay, fine. I've got to learn Git, I've got to put that on the internet. And then, oh, well, crap, people are sending me pull requests. What are they? Oh, I've got to write tests. I've got to do everything else. And for some reason, it's now actually going ahead. Didn't last long, did it? But there's a lot of things that you learn. Continuous integration, all these things, code styles, code sniffers, everything. So you're on to the making. And the first thing you need to do, not to be confused with HTTP APIs, that's my other talk, but you need to design an application programming interface for your code that people actually want to use. There's a lot of bits of code out there that are amazing. They're performant, they're incredibly well separated, their end path complexity is like 0.1 or whatever amazing metric you want to use, but they look like us, like this. Swift is not Swift is really good. It's really functional, but this is just to send one email, right? This is a lot of stuff. You have to make a SMTP transport to explain that it's going over an SMTP server. You then have to make a message instance, and there's a different method for each single thing you want to do, and then you have to instantiate the mailer and then actually process the mail. So that is a lot of stuff. In Laravel, this is the major difference between things like Zend and Symfony, those two, and CodeIgniter. CodeIgniter was functionally terrible. It ignored every known design pattern known to mankind. It was shocking in a lot of ways, but it was so simple to use because you just call one class and you call one method and it does a whole bunch of stuff. Less control, for sure. The Swift mailer gives you a lot more control, and this you can kind of override things and you can dig in there to get harder, but that is a lot easier for people to work with. Naming things is really hard. One thing people do way too often is they come up with these really fun themes for their names. So if you look at chef, anyone use chef? Cookbooks, knives, baker, I can't even. And we did the same thing with fuel PHP, which is something I was involved with. And I think we had the fuel framework. It had the oil command line utility. It had fuel cells for packages. Yeah.
Dropper.
Sorry?
DigitalOcean uses Dropper.
Okay.
It's a virtual server.
Yeah. Yeah, these names, a little bit of it can be fun, but people get a little bit too mad with it. It's like Cake PHP has the bakery and all this stuff, and it gets a bit mad. And that's really fun, but people don't know what that stuff is, right? You've got these cool little words. We instead of in like Rails, you do I think it was like rake or like task run in other frameworks. We had oil refine and then the task name because like, oh, it's a refinery, it's so funny. It's not funny, no one cares. It's like me and two other contributors going, ugh, and everyone else is like, I don't know how to use this framework. The other problem is things like, so that's the actual package name and like the method names and classes, but naming the vendor is really important. So like I already said with PHP SBF versus League is obviously so much easier. But if you don't have some cool little group of people to release code with, then use your surname. If your surname is a name that the majority of developers might have a hard time spelling, maybe use something else. There's a lot of people you see it quite a lot with Russian names and Polish names and things like that, and it's a lot of like, it looks like a losing hand of Scrabble. Like people can't always remember those things. So if you've got to do like Z, X, Y, then maybe pick a nickname, but sorry to pick on Russians there. Sturgeon, it's like the fish, it's fairly simple. I once said Sturgeon over the phone. I was like, Sturgeon, it's like surgeon with a T. And I went, okay, Mr. Turgeon, but anyway. This is another example of people naming things badly. So, anyone know what whoops is?
No idea.
No? Okay, so you know what whoops is. It's an error handler. But looking at this, nothing there tells us that. Right? We've got a whoops, okay, and it's going to run a whoops. Right, fine. We're going to push a handler in there, so we're handling our whoops run with a pretty one, and I don't know what any of this means. So one thing they could do to make that better is maybe whoops error handler would be a good start. But even better than that would be, this is in the code example on their README. Another example would be make an instance of error handler to put whoops in. Then the only word that we're guessing about is whoops, and we can go and look at the composer.json to find out what that is. But your code examples and your class names should be actually explaining what's going on and not just referring to some cool name that you thought up, because it's not very helpful to anyone. Another problem people often make when they are releasing a component for PHP is they start doing one thing and they're like, oh, I could do this other thing as well. That's great. Let's do those two things. I've got two things now. Oh, I've got this other, mega package. Awesome. That's not very helpful. If you do two different things, you can make two different classes, or you can essentially make two different packages if they're like connected but different. A few of the League packages rest on top of other packages because they're useful things that you can share. So separating them out is a good idea. During development, initial development, it can be easier to leave everything in one place, so you don't have to worry about like tagging lots of different versions of little things. But as soon as it stabilizes, when you start getting towards version 1 or version 2, maybe separate those things out, otherwise it's a mess. Utilized common design patterns, something else that CodeIgniter never really did. Even when we got to using PHP version 5 and we dropped 4 support, there were loads of these classes that were essentially interfaces that didn't actually implement interfaces. So they had loads of these methods that were like the same name, but some of them had different extra arguments that were different types, and it kind of looked the same but wasn't. utilize patterns that are good, so maybe avoid singletons. There are loads of talks about design patterns, but if you try and just make things up, then people are going to be a little bit confused about how your code works. If you can say, this is a factory pattern, then everyone goes, oh, I know how factory patterns work. And they can, well, they can look them up if they don't know how they work. Hang about, presenter notes. I'm just winging it at the moment. So yeah, breaking apart large classes is a really important thing to do. A lot of the time, especially in the CodeIgniter world, this is just a talk where I just complain about old projects, I guess. But I was on the team, I'm sorry. Someone actually threatened to punch me in the face because I was involved with CodeIgniter. I was back at Portsmouth in the UK last week, PHP South Coast. Someone goes, you're Phil Sturgeon, I want to punch you in the face. And I was like, what have I done now? And he said, you worked on CodeIgniter, it's your fault. But I didn't make it. One of the problems with CodeIgniter was that it had these really large classes. It had one class, and you just interface, the image processing library. So they had an image processing library, and all of the image processing stuff would go in the image processing class. And it was huge. Some of these things were like 10,000 lines long. If you're getting to the point where you have that many classes, like they say more than 10 methods is probably too much for a class. Even then, that's quite a lot. So you can split those apart into other functions. If your methods are getting towards like 5 lines of code, then they're getting pretty long. Like 10 lines is a bit too much. So try and avoid these 50-line things. And again, you've got metric tools like npath and PHP LLC to complain at you if you do that stuff. Making framework agnostic code is something I talk about. Yeah, sorry.
You mentioned the crap metric.
I can't remember what the crap metric stands for, to be honest.
It's basically when you run PHP unit, so there's like in the coverage report inside the class, there's a column called crap. It's actually been invented at Google, I think. Actually,
Nice.
There's like a whole Wikipedia article on it, and basically what it is the more logic you have inside the functions and methods, and sort of the same stuff you're just talking about. The more methods you have, the more whatnot. You basically get sort of the score of your class, and the higher the score, the crappier the code is.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good metric. Crap, literally crap. It's great fun. This stuff is quite important as well. Like people originally often just think like, oh, these random metrics, I've got a 10 now, yay for me. But these things are pretty important. As PHP as a community, we started to learn that unit testing is more important, and we started to look at the code coverage metric to see how much of our code we're actually covering. The problem is if you have these really large classes and they have, or like really large methods, sorry, and there's like an if and a for each loop and a whole bunch of stuff, the end path is quite high. That's the number of ways you can go through this code. You get to a point where your coverage is quite high because you're covering a lot of the method lines, but you're not actually covering all of the possible outcomes. So the more stuff your method does, the more tests you have to write per method, and it can be quite difficult to work out what you are and aren't testing based on just the code coverage. So the smaller the methods, the less crap you get and you have to deal with. So that's quite helpful. Being framework agnostic is something that's very fundamental to the PHP League. You cannot have a package that only works with one thing. Whenever I talk about making framework agnostic code, all I'm really saying is if something can be framework agnostic, then you should make it framework agnostic. If you rely on, a lot of people release stuff that requires Laravel because they need the Illuminate support package, and that's got some like array helpers. In Fractal, the thing I made, I needed 1 or 2 of the helper methods, so I copied them and put them in my code, and then I don't require Laravel anymore. I put a little attribution to tailor up well, it's all perfectly above board, and now I'm still framework agnostic. So this is something that's really easy to do. There are instances where you can't be framework agnostic. So if you're building something like Dingo for Laravel, anyone use that? It's a really cool addition to Laravel that gives you loads of API functionality. So gives you API, you got excited. Gives you API rate limiting, it gives you OAuth integration, it gives you loads of stuff. But to make that work with every single framework in the world would be way too complicated. You just do so much like abstraction that it wouldn't be necessary. So in that case, totally make it Laravel specific. That's absolutely fine. But if it can be framework agnostic, it should be. You can usually do this quite easily by making bridge packages. So if you want it to work with Laravel, you can make the kind of standalone package by itself, and then just show how to use it by calling the classes. Then you can make a fractal Laravel package that shows how it works with Laravel specifically, and adds like a service provider or whatever other bits of code you need. But the reason I got into framework agnostic code, like I said, I was on CodeIgniter and Fuel, and I started using Laravel, and there was a Kohana OAuth 2 package, which I ported to CodeIgniter. So we had CodeIgniter OAuth 2, and then I had to do some Fuel work that needed OAuth 2, so we had Fuel OAuth 2. And then Taylor nicked it and made Laravel OAuth 2, and it was completely separate, copied code bases. And I'd fix it on CodeIgniter, and then I'd go, oh crap, I've got to send the same bit of code to Fuel. And then, there's a conflict because someone made a change over here, I better put that back in. And it's such a mess. And the whole time, Taylor's keeping an eye on both packages and stealing them for his, and it's just a mess. Just make it framework agnostic. And supporting versions of PHP is something that people love to argue about, like there's a right answer. There isn't. If you support more versions of PHP, then you can install it in more places, and that's great for something like PyroCMS, this content management system I made, where literally the more servers it would work on, the more money I would get by selling it. So people say that's trading off user security for money or something, but if they want to use a crap old version of software, that's their problem, not mine. So we have a bit more of a tough policy at the league where we only support the versions of PHP that PHP support. So once something goes past the end of life, we make sure the next major version drops that support. So right now we support, I think 5.4's gone EOL now, hasn't it? So the next major versions have to drop PHP 5.4 support, and they can maintain a version 2 branch that has 5.4 support and fix some bugs, but the version 3 of the branch will only support new versions of PHP, right? Put it on GitHub. Anyone use Bitbucket? Right. Like, do you use Bitbucket for your private repositories because you have unlimited free ones, but you hate using it for public code? Yeah, right. This was a thing for a while. CodeIgniter put it up on Bitbucket, and they were like, I basically campaigned for ages for CodeIgniter to be open so people could send pull requests because it was on some private subversion. And after like 6 months of me nagging them and just slapping them about it, they went, fine, we'll put it on Bitbucket. And they're like, see, Phil, no one cares. No one sent any pull requests. I'm like, that's because everyone hates Bitbucket. And they moved it over to GitHub, and we had 1,000 pull requests in the next year. Who writes tests for their code? Nice. Do that. Otherwise, Chris Hartgess will find you, and he will kill you. They give you great opportunity to just make these like sweeping changes. With Fractal, I recoded it like 4 times, and the API stayed basically the same, but I just gutted the whole thing. My tests were in place. I don't test private methods because that means you can't gut it and start again. But all of the places in which users could possibly interact with the code, I tested that, it stayed the same, and I recoded everything, and it's more performant and prettier and less crap. So write tests for your code. PHP unit's good. PHP spec, anyone? Getting into the spec way of things over in the Ruby world, it's a lot of fun. The trouble with PHP unit is that you basically, one test file per class. One test file per class is really drilled into you that you can only have one test file per class. And you get to this point where you have this setup method at the top that has to set up everything for every test in your class, and that's going to run for tests that don't need it. So then you end up putting some of the setup code in your PHP, in your function, in the test function, and then your test is like 20 lines long, and only 2 of them are actually asserting anything. So the PHP spec approach is that you have contexts, and you can say, when this data is set up, then these tests should work in this certain way, and that's kind of a cool way of breaking it down. So maybe check spec out. Composer and packages, anyone heard of those? Everyone now. This slide is there just to remind you, for the love of God, don't use PEAR. I put this together a while ago when there were a lot of sites that were like, well, we released it on packages, but we got it on PEAR as well, just for the one person that still uses that. And even PHP unit and Symfony and all of the kind of the last bastions of support for PEAR are gone. No one uses them anymore, so just don't use PEAR. Don't host your code in a zip file on your blog either. Yeah. Apparently it's the same thing. Yeah, absolutely. But just more elitist and more Sturgeon branded. So generally in the CodeIgniter days, the way we used to get our code was there was a wiki that you copy and paste from, and it would occasionally turn straight quotes into curly quotes. That was awesome for syntax errors. Or the other approach was that people would just shove it on their blogs. And you download this code, and you're like, oh great, this Twitter library does exactly what I want. And you start using it, and you realize a year later that there's some massive gaping security hole, and because you missed his tweet or didn't subscribe to his RSS feed, or it just ends up being a complete mess and you just get hacked. So use Composer and you get updates for free. It's amazing. If you don't use Composer, then that's how you do it. You just make a composer.json, which is very similar to a gem spec or anything else. and you put in a name with your clearly readable human name. You put in a description so people know what the hell it's doing. I found a lot, I started getting really OCD. I was like, I must make every package on Packagist have a description. So this is how Packagist looks for now. Has anyone seen the new redesign coming? Yeah. It's really pretty. Is it up? It's up. I don't PHP anymore. I don't know these things. I saw the pull request come in. Okay. It can't be more than a couple of weeks. Okay, what? Jeez. Time flies when you're stuck in the world of Ruby. Nice. Well, that's how it used to look for a little bit of history. And then just tag your stuff on GitHub there. Once you tag your releases, yes, sir.
Sorry, I promised last comment that.
No, carry on. I can't go back a slide. It literally won't.
So on the composer side, you know you can do composer validate?
Yes. Oh yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, so when you're making that composer.json file, it's super easy to put trailing commas or mess up the syntax or put a quote in your description.
If you forget the license or the package name is not properly namespace and stuff like that.
That's a new feature then. It didn't used to tell you about the license. That's pretty cool.
The license is interesting. The package name sometimes if it's mixed case versus lowercase and everything else.
That's awesome. Yeah, Composer's got a lot of really cool features. So this is then another important thing to do once you're hooked up with Packagist and you're on Composer. All you have to do is git tag versions. Don't put V at the front. We know it's a tag. It's just unnecessary. But then you put your little changelog in there and you can link people through to that and they can all see what's going on. Semantic versioning, everyone? Yeah? Well done. Just means major minor patch is the 3 versions, so 1, 2, 3 you can say. Just means breaking, new features are coming out, but the old stuff still works. And then bug fixes are like, ah, crap, fix that. Sorry. And things should always keep on working. They can be performance boosts. They can be bug fixes, like security patches. Anything that goes into a last thing. And I don't know what those notes were about. Coding standards, pretty important. PSR2, everyone? Yeah, absolutely. Everyone hate it? Anyone hate tabs? Hate spaces? Yeah. So PSR2 is not. Everyone thinks the fig came together and just kind of, everyone agreed and we're like, ha, screw the rest of the community. We all agree on this stuff. But really everyone in there, every single item, like whether this should go there or that should go there, it was all done via a vote and it came together, everyone lost. I used to be completely Allman. I used to love putting my braces on the next line. I used to love tabs. I used to love snake case. And then PSR2 came along. I was like, sod it, I'll just go with the flow. And after a week, I stopped caring. It took me a week to completely change all my preferences. And you can do the same. Don't hold out against it. Just use it. No one cares about tabs. Apart from loads of people that really adamantly do. It's like a religion. Doc blocks are the least interesting thing you could ever think about, but they are really helpful. When it comes to writing documentation, only a certain amount of it can be accurately done by hand. You can only write so much text by hand. Doc blocks let you make a really nice, simple API generation. You have your API docs, your generated docs, and your guides, your human readable stuff next to each other. Don't try and manually make API docs, and don't try and make your API docs be the human readable guides. 2 separate things, right? Continuous integration, if you don't have that, you don't know if your code actually works. The number of times people have just like run the test locally and pushed it off and then pulled down, like, oh, there was a break there and pushed it off and it doesn't work. Or it's a Friday and you just merge a pull request because you're like, I'm pretty sure it works and it doesn't. And then you tag a hotfix because there's some gaping security bug and you break everyone's servers. Just don't do that. You can also get really kind of anal about things. You can run PHP code sniffer. Anyone do that? Whether you want to do that or not, like whether you want to break the build because someone accidentally didn't put a line at the end of the file is up to you. At the league, we do it just because we want to make sure our code is standard, but you probably don't need to worry about that. And scrutinize the CI. Who likes being told if they didn't eat their greens? Like this method's a little bit long. You shouldn't have done that. It's a really good way of keeping your code quality high if you care. Have a license, already established, pretty important. Had a few instances where we someone merged some code and then didn't like the fact that we took 2 days to merge his next pull request and freaked out and then tried to send another pull request to take his code back, which I've never heard of in my life. And we were like, no, you said you didn't want us to merge to have it. You said you didn't want to work with us anymore, and you didn't want to do any more pull requests, so we're going to refuse that pull request and just. And he got really angry and tried getting a lawyer involved, and we found the guy on the internet, and it was a military lawyer who specialized in people going AWOL, and we're like, send him. I'm gonna laugh you out of court. Luckily, it all went away because the guy was an idiot. But having a license gives you some ground to stand on. If people go against the terms of the license, then you can scream at them, and sometimes it'll work. You can usually use scare tactics as well. That's contributor instructions. Everyone do this. Contributing.md in your file. GitHub looks for a contributing.md file and will say to people who are sending a pull request, have you looked at this file? Now, regardless of how clear you make it about these instructions, people will ignore them, but you then have the benefit of saying, look at the file, you did that wrong. You can put in what style guide, how to send pull requests, whether you should send the pull request to master or develop, things like that. And you can basically control how people send you code. All of these things have been taken into a new website designed by the same chap that designed the league, and it's phppackagechecklist.com, and it gives you a checklist of things to do for your PHP package. It picks out all these things, and it gives you some advice and some links, and you can then put a link in there saying, we conform to 9 of the 10 if you care. Marketing, choose a good name. Make some documentation. There's a few myths about docs. The first myth is that reading the code is an acceptable answer to where are the docs. It's not. The second myth is that auto-generated docs are good enough. They're not. We covered that. The third myth, if you notice these little icons, I love them. That's Bigfoot, I think, or a flaming person. But the other documentation myth is that a README file will do. People start off with a couple of little quick examples, but if you have anything more than one class, then it's just not going to cut it. Another documentation myth is that documentation is easy. It's really not. Like I said, you can spend 20 hours on it and still keep going. Some documentation must-haves, elevator speech. I'm just smashing through these because I spent way too long on that. Sorry. The elevator speech is you need to put right at the top of your README exactly what it is. People submit packages to the league and they're like, this is an abstract handler managing system that can, whatever. They use so many of these terms. It's like it can adapt different cache layers to command buses, and I don't know what that is. So explain it like I'm 5 and do it in a paragraph. It's just so much better that way. Make a simple example. So right below your explain it like I'm 5 real quick intro, put a bit of code. So even if you have people that aren't English speakers by their first language, they can look at that example and see exactly what's going on. Put some installation instructions in there. Don't assume that everyone knows what Composer is. It's not your job to teach them how Composer works, but say install via Composer via this command. And then if they don't know what Composer is, they can Google Composer. Like that. Just put Composer require league fractal. And that's all you need. You don't have to mention versions or anything else. And you don't have to say edit your Composer JSON file. That's like 2 years old. Keep a changelog. Keep a changelog.com. Anyone use that? I think it's made by the GitHub people. It's a standard format for changelogs, and it's really good. Link to where the code is, and link to you on Twitter. You want people to be able to get in touch. Putting your email address is a really quick way to get spam, but if you put it on Twitter, you can block the person, and it's quite nice. I sound very jaded, but I've been doing open source for a very long time. Put some badges in there. Don't go too mad on the badges. Everyone goes like, yay, candy, and just decorates their documentation, but that is maybe too many. But you can put like who the author is and where it is, whether your tests are passing or not. If you don't tell me whether your tests are passing, I don't want to install the code. I don't want to have to download it and run the tests and see if your code actually works. I want to see that it works right there. This is a fairly standard layout for documentation. Don't go too mad with it. Documentation for most projects is pretty much like this. You've got a very clear navigation bar with kind of sections and then different pages. You've got the about, explain it like I'm 5. You've got the badges right there in the front, changelog up in the corner. Most websites look like this. Vagrant, same thing. Stripe, Bourbon for the front end folks. Less does the same. Laravel does the same. It's all pretty standard stuff. So tell people about it. Is very important. Once you're done, like I said, don't do it after 20 minutes because everyone will laugh you out. But you gotta tell people about it. You can pretty much, if you contact Bitfalls on Twitter, he often lets people write for SitePoint, and that gets a lot of traffic. I've written a few articles for them about various different league things, and that got us loads of attention. Twitter is a good place to start tweeting about it. Hacker News gives you wonderfully valid feedback. It's usually why isn't this Elixir, but PHP Weekly is a good place to hear about it. If you can contact them and get your RSS feed put into their input, then whenever you blog about stuff, they will read. And PHP Developer as well. Contact Enigma, ENYGMA, whatever, it's on the internet. And he often will follow people's RSS feeds and keep an eye out for content as well. So it works quite well to me. Maintenance is pretty hard. You kind of build it, and you've marketed it, people know about it, and you're starting to see people use it. But how do you know that they're actually using it? Well, a good way of doing that is just to search for the name of it on GitHub. And this is quite interesting because not only do you get told, this is doing my head in, not only do you get told that people are actually using it, which is nice, but you can see how they're using it. And I've actually discovered things. By looking at how people are using it, I've seen people do these really grotesque hacks, and I'm like, oh, that's a really cool idea for a feature. I'm going to make that into an actual feature. So that can be handy. Look at Google Analytics. I've seen a few people complaining about, it's just an image of Google Analytics. I think we all know what that looks like. I've seen a few people basically reviewing the package and saying, it's pretty good, but it doesn't do this thing that I expect it to do. And then you can say, oh, no, it totally does that thing. I'm sorry, let me add to the documentation and then link the docs to you. And then they do another blog post being like, this thing's amazing. So it's really good to manage the public reputation of your code by looking to see what people are saying about it online. You can see people tweeting about it. You can see that right here, I got a bunch of attention from Reddit, so I got to go, got to unblock it from my host file and go and have a look to see what nonsense they're talking about this time. Keep an eye out on Twitter as well. People like to just sling out complaints and sometimes positive feedback on Twitter, and it's good to know what they're saying, so that's positive. They're even talking about it on a podcast. That's nice. Issues and pull requests, obviously, on GitHub. Keep an eye on those. You need to reply to issues as soon as possible, otherwise that angry military lawyer is going to be in touch. But be nice to people, have time for them when you're handling pull requests. Quite often they submit really bad code. It's either a bad idea, it's done badly, it sucks, whatever. But give them time and kind of nurture their first contributions, and then they can turn out to be really good contributors. Some of the people for Pyro CMS that ended up being like my business partner, his first pull request was a piece of crap. And I helped him through it and I was patient, and then eventually he got so good that he was my business partner. Dealing with strong personalities is hard. A lot of people are jerks, and you have to deal with that. Listen to those that are actually using it. So when people that are using it say this is a problem, it's a problem. Don't do what some people do in the PHP community and say, well, you're doing it differently to me, so I'm going to ignore you. If loads of your users think something's a problem, it probably is. Got to try and strike a balance between changing too much and changing too little. The best approach is just to maintain 2 versions. So you can have a big old change that comes out, be fine with that, maintain the old version for a couple of months. When you lose interest, that's the hard part. A lot of people just abandon code. So the best thing to do is look at your contributors, look at the, actually on GitHub, look to see who's contributed the most, and then contact them. So with Fractal, I didn't have time for it. I don't use PHP at the moment. So I looked at who'd been contributing, and they took it over. You can also dump things on the league. People have done that in the past. With OmniPay, they weren't working on it. Now Kayla's working on it. It's pretty cool. And the benefit of the league is that we can just pass things around. No one cares about the namespace. And yeah, that's it. Sorry I went over a little bit there. Thank you very much.